Hello and welcome to yet another episode in the Mega Tutorial. We are on part 5, building a good setting. So in the previous video, we were trying really hard to kind of bring our character and environment to a next level, trying to figure out how exactly we are going to do things going forward, right? Because as I mentioned in the previous video, the scene wasn't really feeling too compelling. There were things that weren't clear enough, so I wanted to sort of work on that. And the last video, we made some progress, and we had gotten to a place where I thought, okay, so this is something we could work with. But of course, as always, things don't always go so easy, and I have a little bit of a surprise for you. But before that, let's get into the overview for this month. And this is what we will be talking about today. So today I want to have an in-depth discussion on scene and setting design. I feel like it's something that's really important to me and my work as well, right? Because a lot of times I feel like, the characters I draw, sure, I think I do a good enough, decent enough job at them, but I think what helps make my work more interesting to look at a lot of time is the environment and how it kind of interacts with the character, right? So today I want to go a bit more into this aspect of my work and talk about how we sort of go through the process of doing it right live. And of course, right, as the subtext here says, right, I feel it definitely can impact the whole thing really, really massively. And I think I'll show you what I mean, right, in terms of narrative, in terms of the visuals, and it also links up to the second point, right? Um, Finding the right setting or the best setting and the best setting design for your character or your particular illustration, it can really give you a chance and open up a lots of lighting options. For example, let's say if we have a setting like we were dealing with last month, we'll take a look at that in just a bit. Our lighting scheme is kind of limited, right? Because in fact, I'll just jump to it right now. So this is where we left off. We'll be going back to the overview in a little bit, but I think while the scene itself it's something that I feel is something that can be worked with and can be completed. One issue I do have with it is how it really doesn't lend much flexibility to the lighting. Because being in this sort of situation, right, what do we have in the background? Generally speaking, we can have a cityscape, which is what we have now, right? We can have sunlight, which doesn't feel quite right for this particular sort of setup. Or we could have like moonlight, which is what we're trying right now. But it feels kind of limited and it doesn't really leave enough room for very dramatic lighting. And it also kind of, how do I put it? Doesn't give me an option where I can illuminate the scene in a specific way I want and make things look dramatic without hiding too much details, right? Because we're kind of constrained by the quote-unquote reality of the scene. So this is sort of the dilemma I was facing, and which is why I feel like having further developing the setting or scene to our needs can also open up lots of options where we can then refine sort of the lighting within the context of a scene, and then find open up more options so that we can have a more compelling scene or a more compelling illustration in general, right? And while we're working on all this, I also want to touch on the power of the thumbnail, because of course we can look at a scene close up like this, and all the details, not really all the details, but a lot of the details can be picked up. We can kind of see what's happening and it's fine. But that is also from the artist's point of view, right? As someone who's already working on the thing, it's definitely a bit easier to sort of pick up on what's going on, and we might be able to read a bit more than, say, a viewer that just comes across the piece. So to help us with that, I feel like the thumbnail is a really good way to look at it. So usually the navigator tab, as I mentioned a lot of times, is a great way to deal with it. And so in today's video, we'll be constantly paying attention to the navigator tab as we proceed. So as well as also, what we can or can't see in it and how, we should respond to it. For example, if something is blurred, does that mean we immediately take action to sort of remedy that? Or do we sort of work on a piece a bit more before we really, put our foot down and say, okay, we need to sort of change things up beyond just, painting normally and continuing our original plan. And so this will be the overview of what we are touching on today, and there will be a little bit of a time skip. Unfortunately, I did mention that I wanted to do the whole thing live, but I also wanted to keep things organic, right? So I don't want to waste a lot of time doing a bunch of stuff that, how do I put it, is really not meaningful because we've already showed a lot of it, right? There's no need to show the same thing over and over again. I want to also cover more meaningful stuff and then do that stuff, fully live and talk about it as I go along. So I feel that's the way to maximize the value we have, and I hope you will understand. Of course, in the ideal world, right, I'll have a perfect illustration process that I plan out really, really well, and then we just go in and do a tutorial. But, sometimes we have to make a couple of compromises. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Once again, this is where we left off last month. We were building up the scene, we were making some lighting adjustments, and this is where we actually started off the video last month. It was previously in this state, and then I was like, okay, so let's see how we could change it, and then we arrived in this current situation. So at this point in time, as I was doing some preparation for the video, I was thinking about how to further build on this. And one thing I actually thought about, and we just mentioned, which is point number 1, is that sometimes when we design a scene, it's important to not only think about it from our own perspective, right? Because from my own perspective, I enjoy looking at cityscapes in the background. So, I'm satisfied with that. But the thing is, after a bit of thinking, right, and kind of carefully, really observing what kind of, really speaks to people, I feel like it's important to have a sort of scene that is specific and kind of really just specific. Because the thing about cityscapes like this is that unless you have a really, really clear design goal, rather than, just generic, stylish, but, kind of fun to look at, but nothing too specific sort of cityscape, it doesn't really work, actually, I found. So one thing that I wanted to do from this point forward is to really step up the kind of how specific the scene is, right? And more directly speaking, I want to make sure the foreground area, the area around the character, right, this area here, is able to transform into something more interesting. Because right now, it's just a generic building, right? And with a building, I know there's probably quite a couple of things I could do with it, but it just feels always a bit, kind of stiff. Because why is the character standing in this spot, specifically, right? Why not here? Why not here? The thing is that the pose is not really fitting the scene quite well. Because generally speaking, let's say if a character is standing in like a building with this sort of pose, they're presiding or looking over something important, right? And because we don't quite have that here, and the openness of the space really leaves a bunch of questions, I thought let's try something a bit different. So I was sourcing up a couple of references from my folder, and then I came across these. So these are really interesting visually. They're those old school type of trains where you have like these side corridors, and then you have like the cabins, or train cabins, is that what you call them, in the center. So these I feel are really, really cool because it gives this particular pose and this particular camera angle a purpose, right? Generally speaking, when I do poses like this, or I feel like when I do poses like this, I want the pose to be specific to the setting, right, as I just mentioned. Because for more narrow setups like this particular image here on the left, it makes a lot more sense, right, why the character is standing there in the hallway, right? There's pretty much nowhere else they can stand, and it's also a lot more, it also concentrates our attention a lot more to what's in the hallway, which is really, really good because in this situation, right, we could probably have the character look at something, add a little bit of clues in the background behind, and then kind of have the scene come together around that. So I think that is really the strength of this sort of pose and this sort of perspective setup, that it allows us to use to really play with these kind of corridor scenes, which I think are very effective in their own right. For example, stairs as well, just something that's a bit more directional to kind of support the sort of forward, slightly more flat perspective, right? As I think most of you agree, this is a bit more flat and simple of a perspective. It's not very dynamic, so to support that and give it a reason to exist, I think this is kind of the perfect setting we want to transition to. This is another kind of visual image that I got for this. This also could be really interesting to try out, right? The curtains, the soft shape of the curtains versus the harder shapes of the wall. These could be an interesting contrast. You know, the lights on top, you know, again, right, as I did mention before, in terms of the lighting scheme and refining that, this is going to be a great chance for me to use some dramatic lighting and create a silhouette as well. Because the issue I had with this particular image is also that the silhouette is kind of weak and difficult to manage. Because of how kind of the background is a bit nebulous, and then how exactly do we highlight the silhouette. We don't really want to have a daytime scene. You know, we also, basically it's just a bunch of awkward stuff that I was not able to solve, right? So I thought this setting is going to give us a lot better chance at this. But this did not come to me immediately. I actually did a bunch of painting. I have to apologize for that in a way, because I, did promise this will be a fully live demonstration of the process. But I feel like at some point in time, I need to cut out a couple hours of me just figuring out and, digging around the image to see what I can find. Because there's not much to be said. We've already demonstrated plenty of how I paint, and there will still be plenty to go. So, I'm making the decision to cut a little bit out of the process, and what we actually will be doing is actually reverting back to a more sort of standard corridor presentation like this. But from here, we'll try to kind of transition from here to here. So without further ado, let's do a little bit of a jump forward to where I have done a bit of painting, but generally things are still the same, and then we'll make this sort of transition and construction of the scene together. And without further ado, let's go right there. And so here we are. It's a bit of a jump, and I do apologize for that, but I want to make sure that we're in a good place so that we can focus on today's lesson, kind of, which is to build an environment, right? Because the one right now we have here is really, really completely different, but I feel like it's going to be a really organic process showing how I go from this, or previously this, right? To using this particular environment, and this part will be fully and completely live, and you can watch me struggle in real time. And so let's begin. So straight away from the start, we have a bunch of layers here. I just want to merge everything. Let's see. Let's just merge everything and then kind of get rid of the layers we are not using. And let's get started right away. So immediately, I want to figure out sort of the perspective that I want to be using. I want to have the camera near their character's eye level to kind of give us a first-person view into the train carriage, right? So to kind of do that, let's simply just drop, as I always mention, Perspective Tools 2, one of my favorite tools. Simply drop a perspective point here, kind of let it do its thing. And let's give it a color that can stand out. So 1 point perspective, as I just mentioned, it tends to kind of feel very stiff, very kind of, basically just rigid. And it's not very dynamic, right? Which is one of the unfortunate things about it. But what I think is really good about this 1 point perspective is that it captures, as I mentioned, corridor scenes really, really well. Okay, so before we get fully started, I've set up this little board here, artboard I guess you could call it, or reference board. And so here we are, we have gathered up a couple of relevant references to what we might be doing. We might add more to this as, we consult more references and so on, but for now, this is a good place to start. So as we've just said, we've set up a nice little simple perspective grid. And what we're going to do next is to start putting together the scene. So for this, there are a couple options we can go with, right? Fortunately, because our current setup involves really very little lighting on top of the character, we actually have a more of an easy time kind of transitioning into, say, a different setting, like what we're about to do. So to begin, let's place our character in the scene and fit the environment around her. So if we take a look at these two reference images here, we know that the corridor is very narrow. So that is one of the things that we want to capture in the scene that we're going to draw. So to do so, we're going to make sure that we start off right by measuring the scene relative to the character. So notice that everything is still very rough, so not to worry, we'll still have plenty of time to talk about the details as well later on. But for now, let me just open up a new layer and kind of measure things out, right? So if we look at the area right around the character, we're going to have about this kind of width. It's pretty narrow. And then let's just draw the lines like this, right? So this is sort of the box around the character that, you know, she's going to be standing in. And with this box, we can start working on her surroundings. So using the perspective line, for example, we can now start figuring out kind of how wide the corridor is, and then we can draw that in. What I'm doing here, I'm quite sure there's a better way to do this, but what I'm doing here is just pressing Shift, holding down Shift, and then tapping 2 points to create a line. So apologies again if it's a bit hard to see because all the rest of the sketch lines they are floating around, but these are, this is sort of the situation that, or rather the environment that we're currently drawing, right? We can ignore all the foreground stuff, we can even start erasing some of it, so we can make a bit more room for what we're about to draw. So this is kind of my process when it comes to making adjustments. If, say, the adjustment is more complex, I tend to use things like these, right? Just use lines to sort of highlight out where things will go and how things look like using lines, right? Instead of painting forms straight away, which I like to do, as I mentioned in this month's process video, with small details and really unimportant stuff, right? But for big changes like this, we want to kind of start simple. So another big feature, as I always mentioned, we like to capture the big features of the place, right? One big feature that I noticed here is sort of the windows and doors, right? So for now, because it's a bit of a symmetrical image, let's just put the doors on the left and windows on the right, right? And let's see. So a door is about the same height as our character. I believe these trains don't have doors that are too high. So, you know, we can have it about the same height as the character, maybe actually even a bit lower. Notice that I'm anchoring the image we're using the character, right? Kind of measuring her height, making it a little bit taller. This is kind of the point where we want the door to be. And then kind of dropping, let's say, dropping down a door right beside her. So this is going to be our door number 1. And depending on, let's say, the perspective, we could be like, okay, so I noticed that I drew the door too wide, right? Because as you can see here, the doors are pretty narrow. It's like one sliding door, I believe, that slides over, you know, basically the size of one doorway, right? So we need that to be a bit narrower, which is fine. Because in terms of the perspective where we're looking at it, it's going to be pretty narrow, right? Like, for example, this door here, the character is standing here. Also, as we come into the foreground, the door is going to be pretty wide, right? For example, this is going to be a segment of wall that the door here is sliding over, right? Like this is the wall area, as you can, excuse me, as you can see over here, right? This is the wall area, this is door, this is wall, this is door, and it's more obvious here. Or rather, it's wall and window, right? Essentially, there's only like one moving part and then a one static part. So right now here, we're going to draw some of the static parts in. So that's the door. So this is going to be like the static part of the wall. And then we have another door. And this door is going to be like right in our face. So sort of like this here, right? Because we still want to use a pretty dynamic perspective to work with this. So a good thing about having a character stand like this is that we can cheat perspective a little bit and not have to be super strict with it, right? Because we have a very dynamic and kind of low close-up shot of a character, you know, the body proportions distort a lot, it can be hard to manage. But if we have this kind of like mid-distance sort of shot, we can still have the character in the relatively manageable, with manageable proportions, while we can have the scene itself go really dynamic, right? So let's try to get that done and see how it works for us. So this is kind of like the area above the door. And then the door handle is also pretty important because it also gives us another visual cue, right? These visual cues are really important to help us kind of figure out the scale of things. So we want to make sure they're all in place. So let's just put the door handle here on this door, which is what we indicated earlier. And then notice in the background that we just basically have a lot of layering of stuff. A lot of vertical lines, right? Because these are less important in a sense, we can worry about them a bit later on. For now, we want to continue working on the floor, see how the kind of floor flows, right? How the floor flows in terms of the 2D space on the canvas. And then think about how we could work with it from there. So now we also want to handle the windows, which are, from the reference, we can tell are about the same height as the door. So essentially we can simply mark them down here, but in terms of height, they kind of stop below the handle. These are pretty big windows. These are actually like really big windows, I think, for this particular train. This one's about waist height, a bit lower, so we could work with that. So waist height and a bit lower, this would place our waist of the character here, right? And then if it's a bit lower, let's put it here. So this is why sometimes I find it can be useful to have a character on canvas or drawn in first, and then you kind of figure out the environment around her, right? But this is also more of like a side benefit to having to change your drawing in the middle of doing it. So yeah, it's not always something you want to aim for, but it's not a disaster when it happens, right? Because there's still like the silver lining that you've already drawn kind of the character, that you can fit the environment around her instead, which is pretty good. And if we take a look at the window, it's kind of continuous, but with like partitions, right? There's like a big wooden partition or pillar in between like two chunky window segments. So that's what we got. That's kind of what we want to capture here. So we'll have a wall here, and we have a big window here. This is the middle segment, and then we have the two windows here. And then same deal with the character, right? Maybe she's not directly next to a window, or is she? Let me think about that, right? So let's say she's standing about here. Let me think about it. Okay, so we'll have a window right next to her, and then we can continue working with this kind of assumption. So now that we've kind of got a lot our train carriage lines now, let's figure out how we're gonna do the ceiling. Now the ceiling's a bit of a pain because it's rounded. But I think it's a pretty important, I think it's a pretty iconic part of the train, I guess. I mean, there's also one version without, but then it feels more like a corridor. So I do want to keep the rounded top of the train. Or maybe you could even try like a semi-rounded, because this is like one side of the train. Maybe it'll be not fully rounded. So these are the kind of things that I'm thinking about as I draw. And right now we're just using lines to kind of figure out how things flow, whether we need to get the ceiling a bit higher. As you notice here, there's an area above the door that I haven't quite taken into account of. And then we'll have to kind of settle that with the window space. Apologies if I sometimes sound a little bit incoherent as I am trying to paint at the same time. So right now, the setting feels a little bit cramped and a little bit too short in that sense. So we'll try to kind of expand it upwards and give the character a bit more headspace, headroom, because it does feel a little bit too cramped. And it's not like she's a especially tall character, so yeah, once again, we kind of match the line from the character's feet, kind of go up and up and up. So this is kind of the roof. Now you can see me replacing some of the older lines because I don't need them anymore. So this is kind of the height of the roof, and then we can kind of start working it in from there on. Okay, so things are starting to take shape, but I think there's still a couple more things to be adjusted. For example, the width of the corridor and a little bit of the character's pose as well. So it's pretty challenging, but let's see how we can deal with this. So since I've created kind of my line layer above the scene as a whole, I'll be able to kind of paint under it with basically direct painting without having to worry too much about the lines getting in the way. So without further ado, let's try to get that done. This is also going to be me exploring the lighting, as I mentioned, right? Because this scene is setting us up for a bit more of a dramatic lighting, for example, like in this image. So let's see where we can go with it. So for now, let me just pick a more of a generic color. Let's say this particular orange. Have the foreground be a little bit darker. For now, I'm just filling things in. So as I noticed, the ceiling is actually a bit more of a less saturated color, which kind of makes sense, right? It's like a wooden wall, but kind of like a metallic ceiling. That'll be interesting. Let's see how we can work that out. Same thing here on the other side, more of a metallic, or excuse me, of a wooden wall. All the way up to the close-up. We can drop in a slightly darker color. So I'm liking how this is going so far. It's definitely making a good use of the one-point perspective, right? Because this is a great situation to have it. You can have something dynamic, like the train carriage, but you can still have like more of a simple kind of alignment of the a more simple alignment of the, how do I put it, the converging vanishing points, right? Because the main structure, as I always like to say, vanishing point isn't just one thing or three things depending on how many point perspective you're using. It's really based on the major objects in the scene. Because we're in a scene here with this train carriage, the major object here is the train carriage. And essentially its shape or its alignment or whatever you want to call it, its position and our camera's position relative to it is going to kind of determine the perspective, so to speak, right? Because it's such an overarching, strong, visually dominant part of the image that it's just going to be like that. I also want to kind of make adjustments on the fly here. See how we can make the window feel a bit more dynamic, feel a bit bigger in a way. So let me see. So for smaller details like that, I'm not too worried for now. I just want to block things in and make sure we are capturing as much of the relevant scene as possible. So on the right side here, I've noticed that as the perspective fades back, we get less and less of the actual outside view, but we still get like a little peak of lighting coming in, right? So the way I'm going to try and paint this roughly is to kind of just do this. Whereas for the nearer scenes, we can we can see a bit of the outside directly, right? So this is how I'm kind of positioning things. Okay, so we've kind of got the scene largely set up. There's definitely still a couple of things we need to review. For example, the floor. How is that going to work with our setup? How do we silhouette the character in this particular presentation, right? All these things are questions that still need answers. So let's say we have the door, the final door, I guess, sort of here, and then we can follow this line up, and then the door is kind of here, right? Actually, no. Let's see, the door is actually much closer to the middle. So let's kind of just frame her face with the door. Something like this, right? So if we want some kind of color or light to come out from the door, it's going to be great. It's going to work out nicely. Or we could have a slightly bigger door. The door is something like this, right? Yeah, I'm feeling a slightly closer door, nothing too far, because once again, right, as I mentioned, we want to keep the scene sort of, or rather want to keep the areas near the character more intimate and want them to give us more information, right? So if we have the chance, I think it's a good idea to kind of show the end of the carriage. But it's one of the things that we can obviously change on the fly. And also we notice there's a lot of like layering and shape stuff going on here, so we can fill in a couple of lines to sort of placehold for us for now. Okay, so we've got a scene set up. Obviously the lighting is super weird because we're not done replacing all of it yet. So now what I'm going to do is to start working on the lighting and see how that's going to help us with the piece. Okay, so number one thing, I actually want the ceiling to be a bit darker. I know we're going to have to work with reflections a bit later on, but I think it's a bit too bright, right? There's no discernible light source casting or light upwards. So for now, we're going to keep it a bit darker. And outside is actually a bit distracting with the leftover red, so I'm going to paint over a bit of that. Actually, you know what? I'm going to make it night outside, because we're going to have a dramatic kind of lighting scene going on for the inside. We don't really want the outside to be competing for it per se. So yeah, so we're going to be darkening this as well. Getting rid of the light here. So now we have a pretty dark carriage. Obviously it's way too dark. We're not going to be sticking with this. So next, let me get rid of these blocks of paint as well, because I accidentally painted them. Excuse me. Yeah, okay. So now we've got a physical scene set up the way that I want it to. Let's see what we can do with it. So for starters, I want to get a couple more details nearer to the camera. So for example, when we have one door handle here, but the good thing about these things and the fact that we're in a train carriage is that these are repeatable patterns, right? So we can kind of repeat them again here. And then repeat them again here. So this is really going to give us a good idea of how big things are, which is really, really good. Scale is always a super nice thing to have on hand, and when you have easy cues to use to kind of capture it, it's definitely a good way to get it real fast. And then we can paint a bit more form, or rather just draw in a bit more form. This is also going to be great. For example, right now I'm just looking at the reference saying, okay, so this piece of the handlebar is really going to help us indicate where the handle is attached to, the fact that it's on the door that's kind of protruding out. That's going to be helpful as well. So one thing I didn't notice at first is this rail, right? What actually is going on is that there's the wall, and then there's a rail on top that's holding on to all the doors. So that's the thing that we can start incorporating in our drawing immediately. So for example, let's say this is the rail. And then we can just kind of paint it a dark color. Ooh, actually we did not follow the perspective line very closely here, so let's make a couple of adjustments. Notice that for this, I'm just working on an alternate different layer because I feel like it's a bit more flexible. We're dealing with a lot of moving parts that are new, so I want to kind of sort them out a bit by bit, right, before I fully get in with it and work with it directly. So yeah, the doors are something like this, and then we have the bulge of the door, right, and then we have the indentation in a sense of the room beyond. So this is kind of how I want to start working with it, but obviously it's still rough and the perspective is not completely accurate for now. So I'm going to undo that for a bit and figure out the forms. So these things are really important when you're trying to construct the scene, because as I mentioned, right, it's not only about bringing the character or bringing the scene a bit closer to the character, so we have something directly relevant and recognizable to look at. We also need to make it at least a little bit more accurate to real life, so that, you know, people can look at it and enjoy it for what it is, right? So let's say this door, excuse me, should be using an eraser instead. So this door is kind of closed. Right, this door is kind of closed because of how it is. And then the door has a window as well, which is pretty big, actually. But maybe for the sake of the illustration, we can shrink it down just a little bit. We can shrink it down just a little bit. But these are things we can work with later. Okay, so right now we are in a situation where we've started to figure out the scene. We started to get a good look of how the scene might look like. What I want to do next is actually to start adding in the lighting, because the lighting is going to be a big part of how we determine the scene is going to look like. It's something that's really central to the scene. I don't want to put it off any longer. So let's see what we can do. So for lighting, I just want to work on a new layer because that's going to give us the most flexibility to work with. We can erase and add stuff as needed. So what I'm thinking is that I want to light immediately behind the character, illuminating the area, well, you know, immediately behind the character. So let's see how that is going to work. So let's just add a very, very bright light. With the help of our perspective tool, we can kind of figure out the light above the character. Right above the character is somewhere here, right? So if we move it a bit behind, we can have a bit of light here instead. So if we have a lighting fixture here, let's just draw it in perspective as well, because why not? What is it gonna do for us? It's gonna definitely drop a lot of light down below. Okay, so let's pick that up. So this is a bit of a downside of kind of making adjustments, right? You have a bit more gentle with everything because you've already drawn something and you kind of want it to stay in place as you add different things. So just adding in a bit of lighting, and also want to take a look at how the lighting is really strong high up. And the darkest area is essentially this bottom area of the door and walls, right? It's bright here, it's bright on the floor, but it's a bit darker here. So that's the kind of pattern we'll follow as well. We use this color. I actually have to remind myself not to be I have to remind myself, excuse me, to be a bit less stiff with my brush strokes, because once again, this is still kind of early in the process. We don't want to be too rigid. We want to make the big changes and see where things go. We don't want to spend too much time on the small stuff just yet, right? Okay, so let's see. What I noticed is that the floor is a little bit misaligned, oddly enough. So that's interesting, because for this particular area behind the character, right? This is what I also call a perspective error, because if you notice here is that what we are doing is that the ceiling on the right side is a bit too low compared to the, or rather the wall on the right side is a bit too low compared to the wall on the left. So what we need to do now is to essentially expand it. So I like the height, I like the width of the ceiling, so let's go from there instead. And what we found out is that, hey, actually the floor is a bit too narrow, right? So let's us expand the floor a bit. All these things are like small perspective errors that you might come across as you work, so always keep an eye out. Sometimes things just look weird, and then you should try to figure out why before you continue painting. Otherwise, you know, a lot of the process you'll just be wondering why everything looks so wrong and why it looks so terrible. So yeah, now that the wall is wider, things are going to be accurate as I initially intended. What I'm actually thinking is that we can have the whole area behind the character kind of brightly lit. Or rather have this like kind of staggered lighting in a sense. So let me just roughly put this in. And then we can have like, have it just generally be bright behind the character. How does that sound? That's going to give us the silhouette that we want and need. So that's pretty good. Don't forget the reflection. So I'm just going to kind of put them in a bit roughly. For the foreground, things are going to be kind of dark. So I want to kind of make sure of that as well. Oh yeah, and the floor as well. So it's kind of like the character is walking up to a section of the train carriage that is super dark. And then let's see how we can work that out, the visuals of that, how we can work the visuals of that out. So for now, I think we're making decent headway. Just that, of course, with things that are a bit softer in general, right? It's not completely locked in. It's always hard to get a full gauge of what the read is or how the image is looking. But so far, I like the general impression that I'm getting from it. It looks mostly fine to me. But one thing I do notice is that I feel like we need more of a splash of color. So I'm thinking of how we could incorporate that into the image. Because right now, it's looking a bit too bland, right? The color scheme isn't too great. So how do we do this? And also another thing that I find really helpful when you want to indicate shadows is, or rather indicate light, is just have shadows, right? Especially if you have a singular light source that is very strong. Usually you just cast like one singular strong shadow and like that's about it. So kind of like, or rather you have very hard shadows is what I meant to say, right? If you have very hard shadows, it kind of helps indicate you have like a singular or very focused type of light. For example, a light from an artificial light source, a single light from the room, or like a row of very parallel or equally spaced lights, that's going to have an effect that looks different from outside sunlight, right? Which bounces off a whole bunch of stuff and then makes shadows in general pretty soft. So this is where we are at the moment. So one thing I actually want to do is to start adjusting the colors, right? Because the colors are looking a little bit off for me. So let me try a bit of this. So what I'm doing here is to use selective color to kind of figure out what kind of color mood feels right for us. So this feels okay at the moment, but I think it could be better. I'm thinking of how exactly should I work with it. One thing I do think that we also need to do is add a bit more lighting other than the basic silhouette on the character, because that I feel is going to help us a lot when it comes to that is going to help us a lot, I feel like, when it comes to actually making the character feel more dynamic and become actually visible, right? Because right now she's kind of invisible in the grand scheme of things. So this is definitely a challenging process, but which I thought would be cool to kind of show live. So as you can see, and I'm thinking, filling in a few more details to kind of help myself figure out the scene and how exactly I could build upon it. So this one, I'm going to give it back its brightness. Right now, we're using a bit of a warm light for the central passage. How do I make a train look like a train? So that's the question I'm asking myself now. Let me kind of start with some of the identifying features first, right? The windows on the train are really important. This is what kind of stops this from becoming just a corridor. So I want to cover that as much as possible right now. We do not want to leave that out. The windows are a bit bigger, right? Because, the train, I guess, in this particular design is just all window. So we want the windows to be a bit bigger. We want them to be a bit more dominant in the composition. We don't want them to be really, really small because then it just looks like a house, right? And what I'm actually going to do here is kind of just remove the brown, the wood color from here and re-add in that like small strips of brown. That's going to help us kind of give the impression more of the thing is filled with windows rather than the thing is filled with wall, right? I think that's a pretty good way to go about it. And if the scene is feeling a bit too closed off, what I'm going to try to do is like in the reference, I'm going to make the windows a little bit longer. I think that helps reduce the kind of claustrophobic element a bit. And this is kind of my problem-solving process, trying to figure out how best to present this. This is interesting. And we're going to continue to try to figure this out as we proceed. So apologies if I'm a little bit quiet. I definitely need to do a lot more thinking with this particular composition because it's definitely a challenging one. It's definitely a lot more challenging than I initially anticipated. So, please bear with me, is what I would like to say. So let's think about it from a color sort of angle, right? Because with this, we have a really warm interior, which what we don't quite have yet now. So let me try and kind of match that for now, right? We have a really kind of warm interior. I think this is closer to what I need. So we can kind of have a bit of a color contrast with the black. Okay, so this seems a bit more promising, right? Because it's a bit closer to what we were looking at in terms of reference, what I'm looking at and liking as well. So this could be a good place to start, I would say. But one thing I also like is the distinction of the floor from the ceiling from the walls. So I also want to try and figure out how we could do that. So let's try something like the carpet here, as we see here. Let's try something like the carpet. What that's gonna need, what I'm gonna try to do for it is use an overlay layer and set it to pure red. So again, right, this part of the process is very experimental. I'm figuring out what I need to do, how I can best draw the scene in a way that, tells us exactly what we're looking at, but also kind of is effective on its own as well, right? Because right now, I think we're getting a little bit closer to our kind of desired point, I would say. Right now, see, yeah, we're definitely getting a bit closer to our desired look. But one issue I do have is that the lighting still doesn't feel too great, right? It kind of feels like the characters in like a hotel room. I'm still trying to shake that feeling. So what I'm gonna do next is to kind of add in the windows for the cabins, I guess. For the cabins and see how that particular part works out. Because we've already added in the windows for the exterior, let's also add in the windows for the cabins. And see how it could help this feel more like a train. So one thing I also noticed is like this extra kind of thing at the bottom of the wall, which I'm also seeing here, right? There's a bit of an extra thing. I think it's like, actually I'm not sure what it's for. I'm not gonna say anything. It's just this extra piece of material here that I think it's like a good way to kind of make a train more distinct, right? Because there's these shapes around the cab or the interior that kind of make it look very different from like just a straight up building or a hotel corridor or whatever. It does give it more of a distinct look. So I think that could be important. That could be a part of our missing puzzle piece. And the window sills here as well, I think could be interesting. Or could be essential, really. So once again, I apologize that if I sound a bit rambly. I'm actually also thinking really, really hard as I'm drawing. Because I definitely want to get things right. Definitely want to get things right. But it is a really tough drawing because there's so many details, and this is my first time drawing this sideways train carriage, so I'm kind of really picking out features to kind of add in that I feel are important and that can really help us kind of determine what we're looking at. So I would say things are getting a bit better. The train carriage doors are surprisingly big in terms of the windows. Right, there are some pretty big windows, so let's see if we can accommodate that as well. So you can start working with that. So I want the foreground, this thing to be a bit darker. The silhouette around the character's head is also pretty important, so I want to keep paying at least a bit of attention to that as I draw. And I also do not want to completely lose my local colors. Because again, right, this is like some kind of fancy wood. We want to keep it separate from like the steel or the plastic or the metal in general. So we kind of want to keep that separate. And then there's also the issue of the doors, right? The doors are a bit more protrudy, as we've seen. So we kind of want to incorporate that as well. So kind of like this. Right, the doors are a bit more doors are protruding out a little bit. So yeah, we want to make sure to account for that as well. I apologize, my volume also has been a bit softer during some of the parts because I'm like mumbling to myself. Once again, try my best here, and let's see where else can we add in different things that kind of tell us the story about the scene we're actually drawing. So right now actually the scene is starting to come together. We've put together enough details such that it's not looking like a bare hotel room anymore. So that is really, really much of a relief. And these are also like little bits of form that I noticed in the actual train that I think could be important. So for now, we're just using them as a bit of a placeholder. But what I do want to do is, for example, one thing I do want to mention here is that we want to align kind of the parts of the drawing that are really high contrast. For example, the glass doors and the slab. These are high contrast things that I think are pretty important to align even in a rough stage, so you can just get a good idea of what the scene looks like as it is. Alright, so right now I think there's some good things about the scene that I like, but there's also a couple of things that I still want to continue solving. So I'm just going to continue doing this live, which, you know, it's a bit of a trade-off, right? I can't just show up and tell you exactly all the important things, but I think it's also, I guess some of you are also interested in seeing how I work things out bit by bit. So this is, I think, pretty much the situation where you see me work things out bit by bit. So I like how things are going, so I'm going to try continuing down this path, but I do want to make some adjustments, especially to the color scheme. It's feeling a bit too reddish warm. How do I put it? Yeah, it's feeling a bit too reddish warm, right? Or no, or rather I feel the scene is a bit too bright in general. I want to get a bit closer to this, right? The lighting isn't completely perfect. It's a bit darker near the ground. And, you know, like, look at the floor here. Despite the lights being, you know, around the cabin, it's not, like, completely bright, right? There's, like, bright spots, and then there are dark spots. So that's the kind of thing I want to capture next. Basically tone down the lighting a bit. Near the ground area, for example. Kind of reducing the overly glare, or overt glare, I would say. We're going to reduce that a little bit. Right now I'm being rough because I always have my perspective lines to kind of back me up on it. So I'm a bit more comfortable being very rough with the lines right now. I'm very rough with the going in rough and loose with the lines. Oh yeah, another thing I did notice is the railing, right? So what really makes it feel like a train is also the railing. The railing also kind of gives a really nice, adds a nice touch to the environment. I think it's also a big part of what makes it look like, you know, this is a corridor for traversing rather than, you know, just something that's there. Excuse me. So it makes it look like a corridor that is used for traversing. Let me pick out a brighter color for the railing. Maybe a white railing can stand out pretty well. Or metal railing, so we can incorporate some reflections into it as well later on. Yeah, so these railings feels a little bit high almost. Definitely feels a little bit out of place. Definitely have to work with it a bit more in the future to figure out a good way to place it, really. Oh yeah, another thing is that I also like how reflective the wood is. So it does reflect a bunch of stuff, right? So we also want to account for that as well. And the spherical nature of light. I think it's sometimes a bit tempting to just be like, okay, light is in this slice, right? The light is in this slice, the light is in this slice, and then slice it that way, right? But in reality, I think the light isn't all that simple, right? It's kind of spherical where it comes from, especially with this sort of non-directional lighting, right? It's really spherical. So I want to take into account for that as well. And kind of make it strong where it is and then weak where it's a bit further away. So the light doesn't really, you know, just cut off vertically here, but I think it kind of spills over a little bit here. And does this thing, right? I think that is like a more accurate way to present it. And here we're in shadow. The ground area, we're also in a bit of shadow. And then we can have like this alternating pattern of light and dark on the ground. Okay, so this definitely feels a bit better than before, but I think we've still got some ways to go. As with all this, it's always like continuous struggle to figure out how exactly you want to, how best you want to present a scene. But as I do want to look back a little bit, right? Because of our new kind of setting, which I think with a bit of work, with a lot more work, we'll be able to get it to look a lot better. But with our new setting, we're going to be able to sell the kind of mood and image a bit better than before. And then we're also going to be able to use that to create the lighting scheme that we want as well. So this is what we're currently working on, right? The lighting, we want to make sure it's as impressive as we can get it. Or as impressive and interesting as we can get it. And then kind of work from there. So as I did just mention, I also want to have the kind of character receiving not just one light source from behind her, but also perhaps even some light from the side. So I'm thinking of how we could do that, how we could get that to work. It's definitely pretty challenging, so I want to figure out how it kind of goes. I hope you're still with me. If you're watching until now, thank you so much. It's really it's definitely been. It sounds just as challenging as I'm sounding right now, right? It's definitely has not been an easy painting, and if you're still following along, I really appreciate it. Let's see if we can get a bit more done with the time we have left. So now I think it's about time we make another color adjustment. See if we can play with the yellows a bit. Does the scene feel better looking more orange, or does the scene feel better looking a bit less orange? That's the one thing I'm trying to figure out now. So one thing I did notice is the red on the ground is a little bit overpowering. But I think we are doing a bit of a good job kind of reducing its influence a bit. We want to silhouette the character, but not like in such a brutally bright way, right? Because I think it's what I think I'm going to do now is kind of move the nearest light source a little bit back. So a bit more of a quiet space around the character. What that's going to do is to give us a bit more space and area to work with for us to introduce another light, right? So this is going to give us a bit more space to, say, introduce another source of lighting. And then let's darken up the areas accordingly. It's still, let me flip the canvas as well. It's still a bit hard working on from this sort of rough stage, I would say, because things don't look accurate. It's a bit hard to read the generally what's going on. But until I introduce the next kind of element, like the side light, and complete the lighting, I don't want to really spend too much time sharpening up details, right? Because those can change on the fly as well. Those can really change on the fly, so I don't want to spend any time on those just yet. Let me see. Okay, so I think what we could do here is to have the have a window here, a bigger window here beside the character, right beside the character, so we can play with it. We can have, or the door, we have a door here, so we can kind of see what kind of fun we can have with the contents, or rather this is a chance for us to basically add something, right? Because if we just have a wall here, there's going to be a limited amount of stuff we can do with it. While we have like a door, it's going to allow us to add maybe a few more dynamic elements. I don't know, we'll have to see. So again, it feels like I'm just peeling or pulling back the light a bit more. Because red is such a strong color, I don't feel comfortable using it too much. Don't feel comfortable using too much of it in the scene as well. What a what a tough illustration it is. And the silhouetting, I think is also a good time to mention, right? When you silhouette a character or similar, what you're doing is to really bring out their outer edges a lot more. So it also kind of requires more work as well. So previously, where everything was a bit more blurred, it was relatively easy to kind of get away with a silhouette that's a bit rougher. But now that things are sharper, it's definitely gotten a bit harder to work with as well. Okay, so this is where we are at. And this is this is how things have toned back since we've basically made the floor less bright in general, I would say. So the thing I'm contending with now is how do I show some detail on the character, right? Because right now it's looking a little bit too dark for the character herself. So let's think about how we could add a bit more light back in. One light source I'm thinking could be from the outside. Let's say a bluish light from the outside. I want to see how that works. I want to test that out. So now I'm just roughly painting over, the relevant areas where the light would hit. And I'm using the thumbnail to kind of gauge if this particular setup will work. I think in some ways it's not bad, but an issue I can see happening is how it really sort of conflicts with it really conflicts pretty hard with the strong light we really have inside, right? So it's the kind of the silhouette fighting with the side light, I would say, is the issue here. So another option I think we could try is to have another orange light or a red light, perhaps. Say coming from this particular cabin. Doesn't matter what it is for the moment. We just need it here so we can run our tests. So this one also feels a bit off because of how it kind of how it kind of contacts the orange area. So I'm going to back off a bit and think about how next we could go. This is tough. How should we do this? So if we try a light from below, it doesn't really work, I think. So quite a difficult spot I found myself in, actually. I think the overall image mix is decent enough, but I think I still need a bit more cues and references on how to kind of light the train in the way that I want. So back to looking for references for a moment. Okay, so one issue I actually did discover I was having with the train, it was that it was really feeling a bit too ornate in a way. It feels like a bit too of an old school train. So I thought, let me try, just try it, right? Just to see how it works if we have a train that's more modern. And I am curious as to how it changes the feel if we get rid of the arched ceiling. I am feeling a more of a modern train, so let's see how it works out for us, right? We can always change it back if it doesn't work, but in the event that it does, it's going to be really, really great for us. Same thing, we'll have to anchor the character here and then go up. And then rather than have the arch, we just kind of have straight lines. Actually, this actually feels pretty good to me. I think the straight kind of boxy nature of these new lines, I think they're actually kind of nice. I think this is also like a place where we have like the air conditioning and stuff, right? So kind of get it to face down and be a bit darker if we could. These are actually very metallic, so we could get them to be a bit brighter as well. And these windows, I actually like the shape of these. I think these are those kind of windows that make things look really unique. Or rather, make things look much more identifiable as train windows. So I think this is the kind of design that I will be going for from now on. I'm locking in this new design here. Yeah, and I think it actually works pretty well for our purposes, right? I think we can also get rid of the railing for now. And have it like on the portions where there's no window, which is the design as we see here, right? It's a bit of a more of a modern design, I think. Which I think might be more appropriate for what I want. So again, right now this is just basically the demonstration of my process of kind of locking myself in as I figure out a new setting, a new environment, how to build around it, how to build it such that it does the work I want from it, or rather it does what it helps me achieve what I want. And this is kind of just my process of getting there. Maybe we could even try some shadows leading forward. Yeah, I think now it's in a bit of a better spot. And we can kind of consider tuning back the walls a bit. So as I mentioned earlier, right, everything is kind of made out of wood. So we want to give some of these more of a metallic feel. So I would say for let's try taking out a bit of a yellow from the doors is what I want to attempt next. And the windows as well. So I'm using a really rough selection because it's not that important at the moment. So if we get rid of a little bit of yellow, I think we'll bring out a bit more of a bit of color variation, which I think is nice. But so far, I think there's still a bunch of issues that need correcting, right, before the image will read correctly. But this is also the kind of time where we can look at a thumbnail and kind of see how the progress is going from there, right? The thumbnail, I think, is actually looking quite good. We've got a variation of color. We've got our highlights as well in the background, which I think keeps things kind of interesting. We got a character silhouetted, which is it's silhouetted in a way that's pretty decent as well. So that's nice. So these are the plus sides that I'm counting right now, but also there's a couple of things that we still need to work on, right? Like the door, how exactly are we going to get the door sorted out? Perhaps a more new type of door handle like this, right? Like those type of metallic door handles with like the pull clip type of thing. Maybe that could help create a more of a modern impression. Yeah, so I'll be continuing to work on this. We're coming really close to a pretty long episode here, so I would say it's about time that we take a break for this episode. I'm not sure if you want to keep hearing me ramble on at this rate as well, because it has been a pretty long video. And I think to finish off, I think I will want to do a bit of perspective correcting on, say, these two doors, and then we can head out from there and see how things work. So for the nearer door, I think it's good to just give it like the full kind of expanded experience almost. Give it like kind of this full frame. And also give it that bevel and the metal trim. I think another technique that I think is useful is that when you're drawing scenes like this, when it can be very overwhelming to tackle every single element at once because there's so many repeated elements and so on, I think it could be good to tackle one at a time, right? So for now, I want to try out a different kind of design for the window on the cabin doors. So this might be a good way to start testing it to see if it works. Right, to have it kind of be this sort of door, maybe a bit higher, the windows a bit smaller. Perhaps like this could be fine. Yeah, I think making the train feel a bit more modern was the correct call. And all this kind of goes back to the initial, objective, right? We want to create a scene where it benefits the piece as a whole. It adds to the piece as a whole, and then kind of go from there, right? So I feel like with this current setup, it's definitely I feel like it definitely helps the piece a lot more than, say, a more old-timey style of design, because I'm just feeling this sort of more modern design a bit more. And then if we have a couple of stickers on the windows as well, this really kind of helps add to the modern train feel, right? Because like they wouldn't put no smoking and no eating stickers in the corridor for like more modern trains, I would guess. Or more like old-timey museum trains, maybe, I would guess. Or at least that's the impression it gives me, right? So again, right, we're working a lot with impressions here. And yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how this piece will continue to unfold. So one thing I actually want to consider next is to add in, like, maybe the aftermath of a scene, right? The character is not here just for fun, she's here on a mission or something like that. So we want to kind of start working that in as well. But there's so much to do with this piece. I feel like it's really hard to just end it here, but we'll have to end it somewhere. So as we're getting close, maybe I just want to add a couple of things in the foreground that will like kind of act as a bit of filler for now. Maybe pieces of debris, like pieces of paper. Maybe it's like, a fight where the bad guys have like the briefcase full of money or whatever. That could be interesting. Banknotes on the floor, maybe it's like a bank robbery or something like that, or a heist. Man, we could even have hints of like people getting knocked out in the back, the good old knocked out goon at the side of the sitting slumped at the side of the wall. That could be interesting as well. So for now, this is just me filling in some stuff. Hopefully getting you hyped up for the next video as well. Because this is really my organic process. I honestly feel that it's fun to show this to you guys as well, because a lot of times we just see the final product, and Patreon is like the perfect opportunity to show some of these more nitty-gritty stuff that doesn't get seen normally, right? Because even normally I would say a lot of times it feels good, right? And it feels good as an artist to kind of showcase processes that are very sort of pre-planned or refined, or like very conveniently looking super great. Okay, so this guy's a little bit too small. Let's scale him up a bit. Yeah, but anyway, the idea is that I wanted to take the chance, like on Patreon, to show you guys this sort of very rough process. And since a lot of people would also ask for, a little bit asked for like a full live painting, I guess I just want to show you guys this unfiltered look at how it actually works. Because honestly, I know it's super tempting for artists to be like, hey, here's my process, and it's very, very polished, it's like rehearsed almost, and then people are like, oh, it's so discouraging, how can you just get it right immediately the first time, how am I supposed to do this? But for me, I just want to show you guys the full extent of how tough things can be. Yeah, and then how I try to solve problems heading on from here, right? And even now, right, I'm making adjustments to the guy lying on the floor, because maybe feet sticking out from the other door could be a better way. Because again, right, this corridor is super narrow. Maybe this could work better. Yeah, I think this definitely works better. It helps breaks up the character silhouette a bit as well. Of course, this is going to take a bit of finessing as well to get it to look good. Yeah, but this is the idea. I want to create a scene where the character is in like a train. She's kind of done with this whole thing, right? Maybe we could even have some ketchup spills on the walls. We'll never know. Ketchup spills on the wall. Everybody likes ketchup. Yeah, this could be really interesting. I think what I'm going to try to do next is to add maybe some lighting from outside. I hope you can't hear the planes outside my house right now. It's getting really noisy. But I think there's a lot of hope. I think there's a bunch of stuff we could add here that will make the piece a bit more interesting as well, right? Or maybe later on we'll just find that a bit of rim light here, a bit of rim light on the character. Maybe this will be enough. But yeah, we'll have to see. But for now, this has been a really, really great episode. Apologies for the noise. I'm getting close to the mic so you can hear. Yeah, but hopefully this has been a pretty cool experience, or interesting experience, watching me finesse around with things, finesse around with the scene, and basically construct this new scene with a new setting, as I mentioned before. Right, and checking with the thumbnail, building the new lighting, and really, this is more like, this is not as structured as I would have liked it to be, but in the end, I think the organic nature of things is really just what the reality is, right, when it comes to drawing. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to show this to you guys. Hope you've enjoyed it. As always, please feel free to leave any questions you have in the comments. I'll try my best to get to them as soon as possible. And thank you again. Thank you again for your support here, and I hope to see you next month.